It is my great pleasure and privilege to be talking today to Professor Elena Cimino, a linguist and the director of the ESRC Centre for Corpus Approaches to Social Science, the CAS Research Centre.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. Elena, you have a very interesting range of research interests, focusing on stylistics, corpus linguistics, medical discourse analysis, and so on. What is the one thing that you are most passionate about at the moment in terms of your research?
I think the things that I'm most passionate about, which kind of links together different themes in my research, is communication in areas where there are sensitivities or potential challenges, which is why I'm interested in communication about health and illness, communication in different kinds of healthcare settings, but also on the stylistic side, in narratives that are about experiences that may be stigmatized, such as narratives with protagonists who have an autism spectrum disorder or who might have schizophrenia. And I think linguists have something to contribute in many different areas, but particularly where there's some challenge or some additional sensitivity in terms of communication. And I think from that broad umbrella follow many of my specific projects.
Very interesting. So they all work together in some very interesting way, and we'll sort of talk about the individual aspects of that in this interview. So why linguistics at all? Think about someone considering a career or perhaps just a study. Why should they consider linguistics and perhaps corpus linguistics in particular?
Okay, so with linguistics generally, I would say that it's almost as if people, to me, have to justify why they're not interested in language, in the sense that if we think about all the activities that we're involved in a single day or over a week or in a lifetime, there are actually very few that don't involve communication, and specifically very few that don't involve language in some way. In fact, there are only a few taboo contexts in which language is not really particularly relevant, but otherwise language always is. Of course, there are different discussions about whether animals have language, etc. But language, in its prototypical sense, is also a human characteristic, and it's one of the things that is cited to try to identify what characterizes human beings as opposed to other animals. So, in those two senses, a more philosophical one and a more practical one, it's hard to justify not being interested in language. And in fact, people are interested in language, people have very strong feelings about language, etc. But for me, what is really important is that it's not sufficient to speak or write a language or languages in order to be able to talk competently about that language or how that language works. And so that's where becoming an expert in the study of language is important to me. And to connect to what I said at the beginning, language can be a problem in all sorts of different ways, but it can also very often be part of the solution to problems. Whether we're talking about development in individuals, or whether we're talking about communication about illness, or whether we're talking about political discourse. So it's the pervasiveness of language, it's the importance of language, and the fact that language is very often involved both in problems and in solutions. That's why I'm interested in it.
That's really, really interesting. And so a good conversation starter, but at the same time a sort of serious area of study as well that can help people in a variety of contexts. So let's focus on the medical context and the sort of the context of healthcare communication, because this is an area of study you've been recently interested in. So can you tell us what is the role of language and the study of language in these particular contexts, and how can language actually help in the medical context?
Yes, and I think I'll come to corpus linguistics as well. It is actually well known that language is important in the experience of illness and in healthcare. And in fact, if you talk to healthcare professionals, they're always aware, at least to some extent, of the importance of language, not least because sometimes they encounter problems that are linguistic in nature. So as part of the experience of illness, we talk to other people about our symptoms, we interact with doctors, we read medical literature, we Google our symptoms online, we might be involved in an online community of people who are experiencing similar situations and symptoms as us. We have to read medication packets, we might consult an NHS site. If we have an operation, we have to sign a consent form. So language communication generally, including multimodal communication and verbal communication in particular, spoken and written, are very central in healthcare. And sometimes that communication is kind of subsidiary to a non-linguistic event. So a surgical procedure is primarily a non-linguistic event. However, and there is research on this in operating theatres, there is very important communication, some of it verbal, some of it non-verbal, that goes on, and errors in that communication or misunderstandings can have consequences for the non-linguistic event that is happening. But there are some contexts where communication is much more central. So in the case of mental illness, for example, both the exposition of the problem and sometimes the treatment involves interaction. So there are many different ways in which language is important in the context of health. And of course there are many linguists of different kinds who study language in healthcare. So there are conversation analysts who look at doctor-patient interaction. There are people from literacy studies who look at health literacies and the importance of having a certain level of health literacy in order to be able sometimes even to receive what you're entitled to, especially in a national health system. But what I am particularly interested in is areas where, for different reasons, the data that we might want to deal with is large. And that is where corpus tools are very important, sometimes and very often in combination with other methods. So, for example, increasingly with the development of the internet and Web 2, not only I defy anybody to say they've never Googled their symptoms, but also we join online communities of people who might have the same illness as us or similar symptoms to us. And those online communities are a very important part of the experiences of people. Things can be incredibly helpful in terms of feeling a sense of belonging, being able to say things that you might not want or be able to say to even your nearest and dearest, but you can do it in the relative anonymity of a forum. Things can also go wrong, people can take offense, people can fall out, there can be misinformation going on deliberately or otherwise. So there are contexts in which understanding people's experiences involves analyzing sometimes new forms of communication that basically involve large data sets. And in that context, corpus methods are particularly relevant. So I have done work on online forums for people with cancer, for example, and of course there are ethical issues involved in using that kind of data. Other people have looked at communication about illness in social media. So we are at a point at which, in order to be able to fully understand people's experiences of illness, sometimes we need to deal with data sets that are large. And corpus linguistics is particularly useful when you've got large.
So we can deal with that amount of data and look at the patterns in that data.
Conversely, and this is another type of research that I've been doing, we now have corpora that can be used to help healthcare professionals use language in the most effective way. So, for example, I've been doing a project on a questionnaire for the diagnosis of chronic pain, and this questionnaire asks patients to pick amongst different linguistic descriptors of pain. So is your pain sharp or stabbing or burning or searing, etc. And this particular questionnaire, the McGill Pain Questionnaire, has 78 descriptors divided into 20 groups. It's been used for a long time, it's been translated into different languages. It's known to be reasonably valid and reliable, but there are also problems with it recognized in the medical literature. And those problems are to do with how those descriptors, linguistic descriptors, are selected and how they're grouped together. And I have ended up collaborating with a pain specialist using existing large-scale corpora of English to look at each of those descriptors and see to what extent each one is suitable for the purpose that it was is performing.
So what did the study actually reveal? Whether there some matches or mismatches with the actual use of language?
Yeah, okay. First of all, the study revealed that there is a very large difference. There are 78 descriptors, and there's huge variation in terms of how frequent these are in English, and the frequency in a large corpus. We use the Oxford English corpus, which has more than 2 billion words of contemporary present-day English. Differences in frequency are a good proxy for how familiar that word might be to a speaker of English. Okay, these things are never exact, but it's a pretty good proxy. And so there are in that questionnaire some words like hot and cold, which occur many hundreds of thousands of words in that corpus. They occur in your in a new general vocabulary service list, right, and etc. There are some other words in that questionnaire that are very infrequent, such as rasping, taut. And then there is one word, lancinating, that as far as I'm concerned only exists in that questionnaire. So this already is an issue, but we can go to the doctors who sometimes have intuitions about this and say, here's the evidence for the differences in frequency, and often they say, that's why my patients ask me, what does X mean?
So would it be the case that people would be sort of more inclined to pick a word that they are familiar with rather than the word that more accurately describes the type of pain they are experiencing?
Yes, but the thing that we found makes the biggest difference is another aspect of variation, and that is how frequently a word, or how closely that word is associated with pain in English. So in more technical terms, how strong the collocation is between each descriptor and the word pain. And without going into too much detail, when people have to pick from a group of descriptors that have similar meanings, in the questionnaire, the words with similar meanings are grouped together, and they're supposed to differ according to how intense the pain is that they describe. But what we found is that if, for example, in a group, one word collocates with pain in our corpus much more than the others, like the group that has sharp in it, most patients pick sharp. Similar, the group that has throbbing in it, most patients pick throbbing, and that interferes with the attempt that the questionnaire has to capture pain intensity. In other words, what we found by exploiting existing corpora of English, we found some aspects of variation across these descriptors that interfere with one of the things that the questionnaire is meant to do.
So actually using the corpora, we can make some significant changes to the diagnostic tool that can then help people in those situations where their pain needs to be diagnosed with some precision, so that it actually reflects their actual experience of the pain.
And what we're hoping to do in the Center for Corpus Approaches to Social Science is also to start from the other end. So at the moment we're using corpus linguistic methods and existing corpora to assess existing questionnaires. And we're saying something useful to doctors, such as, if you want to use this questionnaire, don't use it to capture pain intensity, but you can use it to capture different types of pain. So that's a very simple thing that we can do, and we provide the evidence for that. Or use a different way. If you want to capture intensity, don't do it with this questionnaire. Do it in a different way. But the other thing that we can do in future is actually start from the corpora. So when something like this questionnaire was created in the 1970s, people did not have the corpora. So people at the time did the best they could.
Corpus linguistics barely started at that time. Yeah.
So at the time, doctors tried to remember what words patients normally used, what words were used in the literature, etc. So they did their best with what they had. And then they did have people acting as judges to try to group the words, etc. So they did the best they could, but corpus linguistics wasn't there to help them yet. Whereas now, we can then start from the other end and say, okay, what words do people actually use? Or even not just words, but what structures do people tend to use to describe pain? And we can then design questionnaires that reflect that, rather than simply relying on existing tools. So these are two different ways. So in one case, corpus methods are used to, broadly speaking, analyze communication about the experience of illness from different sources. And in the other type of project, existing corpora, large corpora of a language are used to assess and potentially even improve diagnostic tools that use language.
This is really fascinating. So we can actually see how corpora can, in very practical terms, help people in different situations, and sort of the medical context in particular. And this is really, really fascinating for us to be able to understand better what people experience, but also being able to make changes to the diagnostic tools, etc., in order to improve people's experience and also improve the medical procedure. If, as you in your research, are able to connect with the right type of medical professionals and sort of talking to them.
Yeah, and there is another advantage of corpus linguistics, and that is that it does provide quantitative evidence, and in some case, statistical significance tests, etc. Because in the medical, broadly speaking, medical research, the prototypical medical research involves large data sets, involve control groups and experimental groups, etc., and then in one way or another statistical techniques, and randomized controlled trials when people try to work out whether a new drug has an effect or not. That's how they work. And then there is in medical research also more qualitative research that looks at interviews or focus groups or patients' narratives, and that is sometimes described as narrative research, etc. Now, strictly speaking, we need both, right? We need research, randomized controlled trials on new drugs, but we also need to understand how people might use or not use a particular drug, comply with treatment or not. And to do that, we need to talk to them or listen to them or understand their lives. Now, the two types of medical professionals, medical researchers who deal with these different methods, don't really appreciate one another very much. There is quite a divide. There is in most fields, but there is definitely medical research. And my hope for corpus linguistics, and I've seen a little bit of evidence of that, is that corpus linguistics can speak to both. Because we have large data sets, we can say, look, there is this level of correlation between how often descriptors are chosen in this questionnaire and the strength of the collocation of that word with the word pain. But also, we can always dig into the data. We can always do a more qualitative study of how do people use this word to describe pain, or how do people use metaphors for their experience of cancer. And corpus methods allow us to go from a broad view to all the way down to the text, the specific interaction, etc., very quickly. So that the qualitative researchers see that we can go back to the original context and take it into account, and even look at the individuals involved and the history of their interaction. But also we can produce generalizations with quantitative evidence. So that is my hope for corpus linguistics, that it helps bridge the gap between those two communities.
Nice. That's a nice position to be in as well.
Absolutely, yes. Yes.
And could you just perhaps, because we've discussed the medical context quite extensively, can you perhaps mention some other projects that are currently being investigated in the Corpus Centre at Lancaster University?
Yeah, the Centre for Corpus Approaches to Social Science has the advantage that because it's been held together by Corpus Tools as a method, it has a wide variety of applications. So we do have projects on, for example, the representation of obesity in the media. We are doing a project on first-person accounts of psychosis. But then we have many more projects. So, for example, we have projects in the area of second language learning. So, for example, we built a corpora, and you were involved with that, of students who take English language examinations, and that corpus can distinguish between students being more or less advanced in the tests that they take.
The Trinity Lancaster corpus.
Indeed. And that corpus is already being used for improving test materials, improving teaching materials, having a better understanding of how people's competence in English develops. And I know that you're now building a parallel corpus of native speakers of English, so that we don't make any assumptions about if this is happening or this change is happening is because you are a non-native speaker, because we need to know what native speakers do in exactly the same situation. So We have research in the area of second language teaching and learning. We have research in the area of sociolinguistics, looking at how particular sociolinguistic variables change across regions, across class. We have a project that takes corpus methods to the study of Shakespeare and his contemporaries. So, for example, there's many different guesses as to how many words Shakespeare invented.
I would like to know.
And some of them are completely unrealistic. The idea that a single individual could have invented thousands of words, no matter what a genius Shakespeare was, is just not realistic. And so what we have is a corpus of a very large corpus that already existed, that has been released recently on, that captures writing around the time of Shakespeare from many different writers. And we can then see which words had currency or which words Shakespeare might have tweaked. So, for example, the word incarnadine, which Shakespeare uses as a verb in Macbeth and making something red, actually existed as an adjective. So maybe what Shakespeare did was turn it into a verb, but not
word class category.
Not invented, yes. So we have that kind of project. We have projects that look at financial reporting documents and that where our analysis has relevance to people who, for example, have to process large numbers of financial reports from companies, and maybe in future even try to predict how do we spot the signs that a company is kind of papering over cracks but might go bust next year from the language that they use in their reports. And then we have projects that cross, all of our projects actually cross disciplinary boundaries, but we also have projects that look at the status of collocational patterns, the company that words keep in the brain by using EEG technology to look at the status of collocations really in the brain. And these are just some examples. We have many projects.
We'll put a link to the CAS website below this.
And we keep updating
it. So people, if they want to read more about that and find out more about that, they can go and do that, because it's a really sort of a variety of
and
exciting
it's growing,
projects.
and people come to us. I think one of the things that is really encouraging is that increasingly people come to us with data that they know is interesting but they can't quite analyze, or linguistic questions, and we interact with different kinds of agencies, charities, etc., and or sometimes governmental agencies, and do whatever research they need. So it's definitely worth to keep looking at our website, because the number of projects increases all the time.
And that's probably sort of the fascinating thing about corpus linguistics, that it can be applied in so many different contexts, as you sort of highlighted some of them that are being currently explored at Lancaster, but there's a whole range of possibilities, and we are actually trying to reach out through the MOOC to people who might consider using corpus techniques in their own particular context.
People will do things we never imagined.
Absolutely, and this is the wonderful part of the discovery. So I think this sort of concludes our interview, and thank you so much, Elena, for talking to me today.
It's been a pleasure, and I hope everybody enjoys the MOOC.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for watching us, and we'll put the link below the interview.